In this video, I'll be taking research from the field of autism, as well as other areas and data from other areas, and put all the pieces of the autism puzzle together. I will show the hereditary factor as well as the environmental trigger. The other things we'll discover is why there is a 4-to-1 male to female ratio, why there is little or no autism in the 350,000 member Amish community. We'll find out why there's a high rate of autism in the Pacific Northwest, why there's a seasonal variation, why there's a high rate in daycare centers, and so on. All these things will be answered. And at the end of this, if you have any questions, if you'll put them in the comment area, I will try to answer those. Most researchers think that there is two things required to develop autism, and one is a hereditary trait and the other is an environmental factor. I would add a third one to that. The other thing that's required is a very new brain, a developing brain. In the first couple of years of life, the brain is definitely still developing and is a very, very fragile condition. So if we get started with this, there's a key clue that was developed by the University of Rochester in New York that seems to have been overlooked by most researchers. Actually, most researchers think this is a condition of autism caused by autism, which definitely I feel is not. What they did was they took a group of people with autism and they tested them for their visual response time, how quickly they could detect motion. And they found that they could detect motion twice as fast as the general population. This is actually a hereditary trait developed back in our hunter-gatherer days, where if you had a very rapid visual, could detect motion rapidly, your chance of killing a prey animal would be increased, and therefore that was an evolutionary advantage, and so therefore is actually a genetic trait. Now, I did a little graphics here to try to show this graphically. If we take the general population bell curve, and you'll notice I only use what I call the fast half of the bell curve, because we're interested in a rapid visual response time. Is the reason I did not show the other half of these curves. So the general population curve has a peak at 260 milliseconds, a little over a quarter of a second, and of course drops off as all bell curves do, but it only goes down to 100. And the reason for that is it takes that last tenth of a second to tap your screen or click your mouse, push a button, whatever the input device would happen to be. Now, if the autistic group had a visual response time that was twice as fast as the general population, which is at 260, they're going to be at 130. The peak of their curve is going to be at 130 milliseconds, which I've shown here. This would represent the autistic group. So generally Bell's curves are symmetrical, so it drops off from 130 to 100, and from 130 down to 160 in the other direction. Now, what we have is all these this total autistic group is in this area from 160 to 100 milliseconds. So this time frame from 160 to 100 milliseconds seems to be where all the autistic people are. So if you're in this range, you're at risk for becoming autistic. If you're on the slow side of the 160 millisecond mark, you're probably not going to have a chance to become autistic, which is of course a good thing. So what I'm saying is that this fast visual response time is the genetic precursor to becoming autistic. If you don't have that, you're not going to become autistic. While we're on the subject of response time, if we go back to hunter-gatherer days, we've known for a long time, probably 100 years, that males have a more rapid visual response time than females, just due to the fact that males did most of the hunting and therefore required the fast visual response time to hunt, where the females gathered and did not require as fast a visual response time. So if we take this general population and we separate the men and women in that group, the men have a response time about 13% faster than the females, or in this scenario about 32 milliseconds is the difference. So if we construct a bell curve for the men, we're going to move that 16 milliseconds to the left, and so the peak is now going to be at 244 milliseconds. Conversely, for the females, we're going to move them 16 milliseconds to the right, and their peak of their curve is going to be at 276 milliseconds. Now, the interesting thing about that, if we actually do the math for these bell curves, if we determine a standard deviation and then what's known as a z-value for this 160 millisecond line, and then we plug that into a z to percentile calculator, what we find is that about 6% of males fall into this risk area. In other words, about 6% of males, actually the number came out 5.82, but roughly 6. And then if we do exactly the same thing for the females, only about 1.5% of females are at risk for becoming autistic. And of course, this explains perfectly the 4-to-1 male to female ratio that we see in autism. It doesn't have anything to do with hormones or anything else. It's just the fact that by virtue of these males having a faster visual response time, there are 4 times as many of them, of males, as females in the at-risk group. So I know this seems very unlikely at this point, so you have to ask yourself, well, what's the difference? What makes these people become autistic and these not? And what we're looking for is what's the difference between these two groups. But if we go back, and since we're looking at visual response times here, it's only logical that our environmental trigger is a visual trigger. It is not any aluminum or mercury or vitamin D or any of those things. It's if we're looking at visual response time, then we have to be looking for a visual trigger. Now the difference, if we think about a visual trigger, the difference between what these people can see and what these people can see is the question. And the answer to that is they can see these people can see a much higher frequency pulsation or flicker than these people can. And that's known as, each individual has their own, but it's known as a flicker fusion frequency. It's If you have a light that you can control the frequency of and you control the blink rate, and you take this entire group and you start speeding it up, there'll come a point for each individual where that light is blinking so fast that you can no longer see the blinks. It just fuses into a solid look. It just looks like a steady light. So as you speed that up, more and more of these people are going to just see a steady light. People over here are still going to see it blinking, and so on, right on down. And when you get to this 160 point, all these people are going to see a steady light. These people are still going to see a flickering light. Now, there's been a lot of work done over the decades with EEG, where you record your brain waves. And one of the things that's been found with using that research is that your brain, even though you are not conscious of it, when you're under fluorescent lighting, your vision system and your brain still are affected by that flicker. And that is known as subliminal flicker. You're not aware of it, but it's kind of there in your subconscious, and it affects your brain waves. And the other thing about it, they found in this research, is that the faster your visual response time is, the more you're out in this part of the curve, the more your brain waves are affected. So obviously, when you get out here, these people brain waves are altered or changed, affected the most. And again, we're talking about affecting these children when their brains are very, very fragile. They're not cluttered yet with language or memory or abstract thought. Consequently, their visual system might work very rapidly because the brain isn't busy doing other things. So this pulsating light, of course, the main source of pulsating light in the world today is fluorescent lighting. And this kind of goes back to the original paper written on autism by Dr. Kanner back in 1943. He said that this was a new, never before seen condition. That is his description of autism, and I would agree with that. If I'm right, and pulsating light and fluorescent light is a major part of the problem, we couldn't have had autism until pulsating light was invented. And of course, there are other forms of pulsating light. There's mercury vapor and sodium vapor. They all basically operate the same way. Mercury vapor lights were invented back in about 1910. Were used mostly for big areas, warehouses and that type of thing. But they eventually became made smaller and smaller, and then eventually they were coated with a fluorescent material on the inside, and that's what we call fluorescent lighting. So while a lot of researchers say that autism has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, I totally disagree with that. I don't think we had autism until we had fluorescent lighting. And that brings us to another interesting point. When all this autism really seemed to start to escalate several decades ago in the mid-1980s, there were several factors. One of the main factors was the fact that the CDC threw Asperger's in with the rest of the autism, which naturally increased it. But another large factor, in my opinion, About 1985 was when the CFLs came online. The compact fluorescent light, the little twisty ones that you can screw in a regular light socket. You know, people trying to be good stewards of the earth took out their incandescent bulbs and put in the CFLs, the compact fluorescent lights, to try to reduce their carbon footprint. Unfortunately, if they had infant children, that may have turned out not to be the best thing to do. So if we take a look at all the other aspects of autism that we know about, and go ahead and make the leap and say that fluorescent lighting could be the cause of autism, let's see what that means for the other things that we know about. For example, the high rate of autism in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, they have so much rain, so many overcast, rainy days there, that they use more indoor lighting than the rest of the nation, for example. And of course, part of that lighting is going to be fluorescent light, and that increased use of fluorescent light potentially is the cause of the autism there. Same thing, especially if we look at the Amish community. There's a couple main groups of Amish people in the U.S., and there's a doctor in Ohio, Dr. Frank Noonan, that's been treating autistic children there. He says he's treated thousands and thousands of them and never seen any autism. He says it's just the way it is. And the same thing, there's a doctor in the Pennsylvania area. He says basically the same thing. He says he's never seen idiopathic autism in the Pennsylvania Amish community. And neither of these doctors have an axe to grind in this one way or the other. So I place a lot of faith in what they're saying about the Amish community. Of course, the Amish don't use any electricity, so obviously no fluorescent lights, no autism. Now, there was a group that tried to find some autism in the Amish community. They took about 1,900 young Amish, and they used a couple different tests to test them. And they came up with a value and said, oh, there is autism in the Amish community. It's at a rate of 1 in 271, which is a pretty low rate. But then if you actually look at their study, this was based on 7 of those children having autism. But if you look at their study, only 3 of those children passed the test for autism on both tests. So they had one test that said, no, these kids aren't autistic, and another one said they are. So I don't know why they threw them in with the autistic, but just as easy to throw them out. And if you threw them out, then your rate goes to 1 in 633, which is very low. And actually, if the CDC hadn't included Asperger's in the ASD group, I don't feel like there would be any in the Amish community. Would be completely void of autism. There was another research done on daycare centers, and there's a high rate in daycare centers. But in researching daycare centers, you find out that about 95% of them are either in strip malls or standalone buildings lit with fluorescent lighting. So it would make sense if fluorescent lighting is the culprit here, that would be an excellent reason for the high rate in those conditions. Researchers also found a seasonal variation, and the seasonal variation they blamed on lack of vitamin D in the mother, because they found that they were looking at the date of conception, and children conceived from December to March had a higher prevalence of autism than those for the rest of the year. But if we look at when those children were born, those children are born just prior to the shortest, darkest days of the year, again, requiring more artificial lighting. Same thing, there's a study done on premature births. The children who have to be in the neonatal care, intensive care unit, show a much higher prevalence of autism characteristics than the general population. And they also noted that those with the lowest birth rates had the highest risk factor. And of course, with the lowest birth rate means more time in the ICU exposed to fluorescent lighting. I would almost guarantee that virtually all ICUs, infant ICUs, are lit with fluorescent lighting. So another thing is in New Jersey they did a trial, and they found out that the prevalence of autism it correlates with basically the family's income. They found that families that made more than $90,000 a year had a 2.5 time risk of becoming autistic, those children did, than those from families that made less than $30,000 a year. And again, this kind of just bounces back to the daycare situation. If you're making less than $30,000 a year, your daycare is going to be grandma or other relatives or friends, because you just can't afford to pay daycare. Where the more affluent families, they can afford the preschool training and the daycare. And that actually, I got to thinking about that, and I thought I would check that out on a kind of a nationwide basis. So what I did was took the median income for each state and plotted it on a graph, starting with Maryland having the highest median income and Mississippi the lowest. Then I also plotted the prevalence of autism for each of those states. And as I suspected, the trend was the same. The lower the median income for those states, the lower their autism rate was in general. It followed a pretty definite line. So as you can see, we just keep piling these things up that are known about autism, that if we consider that it might be fluorescent lighting, we see, yeah, it could be. Where if you take all these other things that researchers have found, for example, like the lack of vitamin D, that doesn't explain why there are 4 times as many boys as girls, and it doesn't explain why the rate's high in daycare centers or any of these other things. So the only thing that I have come across that actually could feasibly answer all the things that we know about autism is fluorescent lighting. Now, the other thing that I suspected was that countries that use 50 cycle electricity are going to have a higher rate because they have a slower flicker rate than the 60 cycle. That means more children can see that flicker because it's slower. And as it turns out, 4 of the top 5 countries and 7 of the top 10 countries in autism prevalence do use 50 cycle electricity. There's also some other factors that I haven't gotten data on yet that I've tried to and been unsuccessful so far, mainly because of the language barrier. Japan, which is a country that has the highest rate. The main island in Japan is divided almost exactly in half. Half the island uses 50 cycle electricity and the other half uses 60 cycle. Now if we could show that the 50 cycle half of the island has a higher prevalence than the 60 cycle, I think again this would be another point in favor of this fluorescent light hypothesis. So all of these things, and there are other things, there are 10, they found 10 clusters with high autism in Southern California. And these are actually turned out to be neighborhoods that are expensive, upscale neighborhoods where both parents are highly educated. And just the fact that they're in an upscale area, you can see how the daycare factor would come into play there. And of course, both parents being highly educated, they both may want a career, or they both may have to work in order to maintain that lifestyle. And again, that's just a throwback to the daycare center. These people are going to use daycare more than the general population. So I could go on and on here about the various things that we know about autism, but as far as I can tell, they all go right back, can be feasibly explained by fluorescent lighting. And the other thing is, almost as important as what I did find is what I didn't find. There was never an occasion where I found an increase in fluorescent lighting corresponding to a decrease in the rate of autism, or vice versa. So again, that's just another point that makes the fluorescent light hypothesis seem probable. One thing you might try, if you think this is not a possibility, is pick up a newspaper and try to read it while you blink your eyes just as fast as you can. And this may be the scenario that an infant's mind is perceiving under the influence of fluorescent lighting. That rapid on and off, and you can see how that would make it very difficult to learn facial expressions or body language or any of the things that we need to become socially interactive with the rest of society. So with that, I'm going to sign off here and spread this news if you think it's worth spreading, and ask any questions you want in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Thank you.